Alright, this is Katabath back with some more War of the Worlds. Yesterday we made it to Chapter 7, and right now we'll be picking off with, of course, Chapter 8. So without further ado, here we go. Chapter 8, Friday Night. The most extraordinary thing to my mind of all the strange and wonderful things that happened upon that Friday was the dovetailing of the commonplace habits of our social order with the first beginnings of the series of events that was to topple that social order headlong. If on Friday night you had taken a pair of compasses and drawn a circle with a radius of 5 miles around the Woking sandpits, I doubt if you would have had one human being outside it, unless it were some relation of Stent, or of the 3 or 4 cyclists of London, or London people laying dead on the common, whose emotions or habits were at all affected by the newcomers. Many people had heard of the cylinder, of course, and talked about it in their leisure, but it certainly did not make the sensation that an ultimatum to Germany would have done. In London, that night, poor Henderson's telegram describing the gradual unscrewing of the shot was judged to be canard, and his evening paper, after wiring for authentication from him and receiving no reply, the man was killed, deciding not to print a special edition. Even within the 5-mile circle of the great majority of the people were inert. I have already described the behavior of the men and women whom I spoke. All over the district, people were dining and supping. Working men were gardening after the labors of the day. Children were being put to bed. Young people were wandering through the lanes of making. Students sat over their books. Maybe there was a murmur in the village streets, a dominant topic in the public houses, and here and there a messenger, or even an eyewitness of the later occurrences, caused a whirl of excitement, shouting, and a running to and fro. But for the most part, the daily routine of working, eating, drinking, sleeping went on as it had done for countless years, as though no planet Mars existed in the sky. Even at Woking Station, and Horsell, and Chobham, that was the case. In Woking Junction, until a late hour, trains were stopping and going on. Others were shunting on the sides. Passengers were alighting and waiting. Alighting and waiting. And everything was proceeding in the most ordinary way. A boy from the town, trenching on Smith's Monopoly, was selling papers with afternoon's news. The ringing impacts of trucks and the sharp whistle of the engines from the junction mingled with their shouts of the men from Mars. Excited men came to the station about 9 o'clock with incredible tidings, and caused no more disturbance than drunkards might have done. People rattling Londonwards peered into the darkness outside the carriage windows, and saw only a rare, flickering, vanishing spark dance up from the direction of Horsell. A red glow and a thin veil of smoke driving across the stars, and though that was nothing more than serious heath fire was happening, it was only around the edge of the common that any disturbance was perceptible. There were half a dozen villas burning on the Woking border. There were lights in all the houses on the common side of the 3 villages, and people there kept awake till dawn. A curious crowd lingered restlessly, people coming and going, but the crowd remaining. Both on the Chobham and Horsell bridges, 1 or 2 adventurous souls, it was afterwards found, went into the darkness and crawled quite near the Martians, but they never returned, for now and again a light ray, like the beam of a warship's searchlight, swept the common, and the heat ray was ready to follow. Save for such, that big area of the common was silent and desolate, and the charred bodies lay about on it, all night under the stars, and all the next day. A noise of hammering from the pit was heard by many people. So you have the state of things on Friday night. In the center, sticking into the skin of our old planet, Earth, like a poisoned dart, was this cylinder. But poison was scarcely working yet. Around it was a patch of silent common, smoldering in places, and with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in contorted attitudes here and there. Here and there was a burning bush or tree. Beyond was a fringe of excitement, and farther than that fringe the inflammation had not crept as yet. In the rest of the world, the stream of life still flowed, as it had flowed for immemorial years. The fever of war that would presently clog vein and artery, deaden nerve, and destroy brain had to still develop. All night long, the Martians hammering and stirring, sleepless, indefatigable, at work upon the machines they were making ready, and ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke swirled up into the starlit sky. About 11, a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form a cordon. Later, a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. Several officers from Inkerman barracks had been on the common earlier in the day, and one, Major Eden, was reporting to be missing. The colonel of the regiment came to the Chobham Bridge and was busy questioning the crowd at midnight. The military authorities were certainly alive to the seriousness of the business. About 11, the next morning's papers were able to say a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxims, and about 400 men of the Cardigan Regiment started from Aldershot. A few seconds after midnight, the crowd in the Chertsey Road Woking saw a star fall from the heavens into the pine woods to the northwest. It had a greenish color and caused a silent brightness like summer lightning. This was the second cylinder. And that was chapter 8. One second, I'm just going to grab a drink. Chapter 9. The Fighting Begins. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, hot and close, with, I am told, a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept a little, but though my wife had succeeded in sleeping, and I rose early, I went into my garden before breakfast, stood listening. But towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. The milkman came as usual. I heard the rattle of his chariot, and I went around the side of the gate to ask the latest news. He told me that during the night the Martians had been surrounded by troops, and that guns were expected. Then a familiar, reassuring note. I heard a train running towards Woking. They aren't to be killed, said the milkman. That can possibly be avoided. I saw my neighbor gardening, chatted with him for a time, and then strolled into breakfast. It was a most unexceptional morning. My neighbor was of the opinion that the troops would be able to capture or destroy the Martians during the day. It's a pity they make themselves so unapproachable, he said. It would be curious to know how they live on another planet. We might learn a thing or two. He came up to the fence and extended a handful of strawberries, for his gardening was as generous as it was enthusiastic. At the same time, he told me of the burning of the pine woods about the Byfleet golf links. They say, said he, there's another of those blessed things fallen there. Number 2. But one's enough, surely. This lot'll cost the insurance people a great pretty penny before everything is settled. He laughed with an air of the greatest good humor as he said this. The woods, he said, were still burning, and pointed out haze of smoke to me. They will be hot underfoot for days, on account of the thick soil of pine needles and turf, he said, then grew serious over poor old Gilvy. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk down towards the common. Under the railway bridge, I found a group of soldiers, sappers, I think. Men in small, round caps, dirty red jackets unbuttoned, and showing their blue shirts, dark trousers, and boots coming to the calf. They told me no one was allowed over the canal. And, looking along the road towards the bridge, I saw one of the Cardigan men, standing sentimental there. I talked with these soldiers for a time. I told them of my sight of the Martians on the previous evening. None of them had seen the Martians, and they had the vaguest ideas of them, so that they plagued me with questions. They said that they did not know who had authorized the movements of the troops. Their idea was that a dispute had arisen at the Horse Guards. The ordinary sapper is a great deal better educated than the common soldier, and they discussed the peculiar conditions of the possible fight with some acuteness. I described the heat ray to them, and they began to argue among themselves. Crawl up under cover and rush them, I say. One. Get out, said another. Let's cover against this air raid. Sticks to cook here. What we got to do is go in as near to the ground as they'll let us, and then drive a trench. Borrow your trenches. You always want trenches. You ought to have been born a rabbit, Snippy. Ain't they got any next then? Said a third abruptly, a little contemplative dark man smoking a pipe. I repeated my description. Octopuses, he said. That's what I calls them. Talk about fishers or men, fighters of fish, it is this time. It ain't no murder killing beasts like that, said the first speaker. Why not shed the darn things and right off and finish 'em, said the little dark man. You can tell what they might do. Where's your shells, this first speaker? There ain't no time. Do it in a rush, that's my tip, and do it at once. So they discussed it. After a while, I left them, and went on the railway station to get as many morning papers as I could. But I could not weary the reader with a description of that long morning, and of the longer afternoon. I did not succeed in getting glimpses of the common, or even Horsell and Chobham Church's towers were in the hands of the military authorities. The soldiers I addressed didn't know anything. The officers were mysterious as well as busy. I found people in the town quite secure again, in the presence of the military, and I heard for the first time from Marshall, the tobacconist, that his son was among the dead on the common. The soldiers had made the people of the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. I got back to lunch about 2:30, very tired, for, as I had said, the day was extremely hot and dull, and in order to refresh myself I took a cold bath in the afternoon. About 4:30, I went up to the railway station to get an evening paper, for the morning papers had contained only very inaccurate description of the killing of Stent Henderson, Ogilvy, and the others. But there was little I didn't know. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. They seemed busy in their pit, and there was a sound of hammering and an almost continuous streamer of smoke. Apparently they were busy getting ready for a struggle. Fresh attempts had been made to signal, but without success. Was the stereotype formula of the papers. The sapper told me it was done by a man in a ditch with a flag on a long pole. The Martians took as much notice of such advances as we should of the lowing of a cow. I must confess the sight of all this armament, all this preparation, greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent, and defeated the invaders in a dozen striking ways, something of my schoolboy dreams of battle. Battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me that time. They seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3 o'clock there began the thud of a gun at measured intervals from Chertsey or Addlestone. I'd learned that the smouldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was being shelled, in the hopes of destroying that object before it opened. It was only about 5, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 in the evening, as I sat at tea with my wife in the summer house, talking vigorously about the battle that was lowering upon us, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing. Close on the heels of that came a violent rattling crash, quite close to us, that shook the ground, and, staring out upon the lawn, I saw the tops of trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church beside it slid down into ruin. The pinnacle of the mosque had vanished, and the roof line for the college itself looked as if a 100-ton gun had been at work upon it. One of our chimneys cracked as if a shot had hit it. Blew, and in a piece of it came clattering down the tiles, and made a heap of broken red fragments upon the flower bed by my study window. I and my wife stood amazed. Then I realized the crest of Maybury Hill must be within range of the Martians' heat ray, now that the college was cleared out of the way. At that, I gripped my wife's arm, and without ceremony ran her out into the road, and I fetched out the servant, telling her I would go upstairs for myself for the box she was clamoring for. We can't possibly stay here, I said, and as I spoke the firing reopened for a moment upon the common. But where are we to go? Said my wife in terror. I thought, perplexed. Then I remembered her cousins at Leatherhead. Leatherhead! I shouted above the sudden noise. She looked away from me. Downhill, the people were coming out of the houses, astonished. How are we to get to Leatherhead? She said. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. We galloped through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted and began running from house to house. The sun, shining through the smoke that drove up from the tops of the trees, seemed blood red, and threw an unfamiliar lurid light upon everything. Stop here, said I. You are safe here, and I started off at once. The Spotted Dog, for I knew the landlord had a horse and a dog-cart. I ran, for I perceived that in a moment everyone upon this side of the hill would be moving. I found him, in his bar, quite unaware of what was going on behind his house. The man stood with his back to me, talking to him. I must have £1, said the landlord, and I'll have no one to drive it. I'll give you 2, said I, over the stranger's shoulder. What for? And I'll bring it back by midnight, I said. Lord, said the landlord, what's the hurry? I'm selling my bit of a pig, £2, and you bring it back. What's going on now? I explained hastily that I had to leave my home, and to secure the dog-cart. At the time it did not seem to me nearly so urgent that the landlord should leave his. I took care to have the cart there and then, drove it off down the road, and leaving it in charge of my wife and servant, rushed into my house and packed a few valuables, such plate as we had, and so forth. The beech trees below the house were burning white while I did this, and the palings upon the road glowed red. While I was occupied in this way, one of the dismounted hussars came running up. He was going from house to house, warning people to leave. He was going on as I came out of my front door, lugging my treasures, done up in a tablecloth. I shouted after him, What news? He turned, stared, bawled something about crawling out in a thing like a dish cover, and ran onto the gate of the house at a crest. A sudden whirl of black smoke, driving across the road, hid him for a moment. I ran to my neighbor's door and rapped to satisfy myself on what I already knew, that his wife had gone to London with him, and locked up their house. I went again, according to my promise, to get my servant's box, lugged it out, clapped it beside her on the trail of the dog-cart, and then caught the reins and jumped up into the driver's seat beside my wife. In another moment we were clear of the smoke and noise, and then spanking down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill towards the old Woking. In front was a quiet sunny landscape, a wheat field ahead on either side of the road, and the Maybury Inn, with its swinging sign. I saw the doctor's cart ahead of me. At the bottom of the hill, I turned my head to look at the hillside I was leaving. Thick streamers of black smoke, shot with its threads of red fire, were driving up into the still air and throwing dark shadows upon the green treetops eastward. Smoke already extended far away to the east and west, to the Byfleet pine woods eastward, and to Woking on the west. The road was dotted with people running towards us, and very faint now, but very distinct through the hot, quiet air. One heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, and an intermittent crackling of rifles. Apparently the Martians were setting fire to everything within range of their heat ray. I am not an expert driver, and I had immediately to turn my attention to the horse. When I looked back again, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I slashed the horse with a whip and gave him a loose rein until Woking and Send lay between us in that quivering tumult. I overlook and pass the doctor between Woking and Send. Chapter 9 completed. Just gonna get another quick drink. I'll be right back. Chapter 10. In the Storm. Leatherhead is about 12 miles from Maybury Hill. The scent of hay was in the air through the lush meadows beyond Pierford. and the hedges on either side were sweet and gay with multitudes of dog roses. The heavy firing that broke out while we were driving down Maybury Hill ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving the evening very peaceful and still. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest while I took supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. Commended my wife to their care. My wife was curiously silent throughout the drive, seemed oppressed with forebodings of evil. I talked to her reassuringly, pointing out that the Martians were tied to the pit by sheer heaviness, and at the utmost could but crawl a little out of it, but she answered only in monosyllables. It had not been for my promise to the innkeeper, she would, I think, have urged me to stay in Leatherhead that night. Would that I had. Her face, I remember, was very white as we parted. For my own part, I had been feverishly excited all day. Something very like the war fever that occasionally runs through a civilized community had gotten into my blood. And in my heart, I was not so very sorry I had to return to Maybury that night. I was even afraid that last fusillade I had heard might in the extermination of our invaders from Mars. I can best express my state of mind by saying that I wanted to be at the death. It was nearly 11 when I started to return. The night was unexpectedly dark to me. Walking out of the lighted passage of my cousin's house, it seemed indeed black, and it was as hot and as close as the day. Overhead, the clouds were driving fast, albeit not a breath stirred the shrubs about us. My cousin's man lit both lamps. Happily, I knew the road intimately. My wife stood in the light of the doorway and watched me until I jumped into the dog cart. Then abruptly she turned and went in, leaving my cousins side by side, wishing me good hap. I was a little depressed at first with the contagion of my wife's fears, but very soon my thoughts were reverted to the Martians. At that time I was absolutely in the dark as to the course of the evening's fighting. I did not know even the circumstances that had precipitated the conflict. As I came through Occam, for that was the way I returned, and not through Send and Old Woking, I saw along the western horizon a blood-red glow, which, as I drew nearer, crept slowly up at the sky. Driving clouds of gathering thunderstorm mingled there with masses of black and red smoke. Ripley Street was deserted, and except for lighted window or so, the village showed not a sign of life. But I narrowly escaped an accident at the corner of the road to Parriford, where a knot of people stood with their backs to me. They said nothing to me as I passed. I did not know what they knew of the things that happened beyond the hill, nor do I know if the silent houses I passed on my way were sleeping securely or deserted or empty, or harassed and watching against the terror of the night. From Ripley till I came through Parriford, I was in the valley of the Wey. The red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill beyond the Parriford church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered with the first imitation of the storm that was upon me. Then I heard midnight pealing out from the Parriford church behind me. Then came silhouette of Maybury Hill, with its treetops and roofs black and sharp against the red. Even as I beheld this lurid green glare lit the road about me, and showed the distant woods towards Addlestone. I felt a tug at the reins. I saw that the driving clouds had been pierced, as it were, by a thread of green fire. Suddenly, lighting their confusion and falling into the field to my left, it was the third falling star. Close on its apparition, and blindingly violet by the contrast, danced out the first lightning by the gathering storm, and the thunder burst like a rocket overhead. The horse took the bit between its teeth and bolted. A moderate incline runs towards the foot of the Maybury Hill, and down this we clattered. Once the lightning had begun, it went on as rapid in a succession of flashes as I had ever seen. The thunderclaps, treading one on the heels of another, with a strange crackling accompaniment, sounded more like the workings of a gigantic electric machine than the usual detonating reverberations. The flickering light was blinding and confusing, and thin hail smote gustily at my face as I drove down the slope. At first I regarded little but the road before me. Then abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill. At first I took it for the wet roof of a house, but one flash following another showed it to be in swift rolling movement. It was an elusive vision, a moment of bewildering darkness, and then, in a flash like daylight, the red masses of the orphanage near the crest of the hill, the green tops of the pine trees, and this problematical object came out clear and sharp as bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them against it in its career. A walking engine of glittering metal, striding now across the heather. Articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantly. As it seemed with the next flash, 100 yards nearer, can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowled violently along the ground? That was the impression those instant flashes gave, but instead of a milking stool, imagine it had a great body of machinery on a tripod stand. Then suddenly the trees in the pinewood lay ahead of me were parted, as brittle reeds were parted by a man thrusting through them. They were snapped off and driven headlong, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing, as it seemed, headlong towards me, and I was galloping hard to meet it. At the sight of the second monster, my nerve went altogether. Not stopping to look again, I wrenched the horse's head hard round to the right. In another moment the dog-cart heeled over upon the horse. The shaft smashed noisily, and I was flung sideways and fell heavily into a shallow pool of water. I crawled out almost immediately, and crouched. My feet were still in the water, under a clump of firs. The horse lay motionless. Its neck was broken, poor brute. And by the lightning flashes, I saw the black bulk of the overturned dog-cart, and the silhouette of the wheel still spinning slowly. In another moment the colossal mechanism went striding by me, and passed uphill towards Pireford. Seen nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere insensate machine driving on its way. Machine it was, with a green metallic pace, the long, flexible, glittering tentacles, one of which gripped a young pine tree, swinging and was rattling about its strange body. It picked its road as it went striding along, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved to and fro with the inevitable suggestion of a head looking about. Behind the main body was a huge mass of white metal, like a gigantic fisherman's basket, and puffs of green smoke squirted out of the joints of the limbs as the monster swept by me, and in an instant it was gone. So much I saw then, all vaguely, for the flickering of the lightning in lightning highlights and in dense black shadows. As it passed, it set up an exulting, deafening howl that drowned the thunder. Halloo! Halloo! And in another minute, it was with its companion, half a mile away, stooping over something in the field. I have no doubt this thing in the field was the third of the 10 cylinders they had fired at us from Mars. Some minutes I lay there in the rain, in darkness, watching, by the intermittent light, these monstrous things of metal moved about in the distance over the hedge-tops. A thin hail was now beginning, and as it came and went, their figures grew misty and then flashed into clearness again. Now and then came a gap in the lightning, and the night swallowed them up. I was soaked with hail above and a puddle of water below. It was some time before my blank astonishment would let me struggle up the bank to a drier position, or think at all of my imminent peril. Not far from me, the little one-roomed squatter's hut of wood, surrounded by a patch of potato garden. I struggled to my feet at last, and crouching and making use of every chance of cover, made a run for this. I hammered at the door, but I could not make the people hear, if there were any people inside, and after a time I desisted, and availing myself of a ditch for the greater part of the way, succeeded in crawling, unobserved by these monstrous machines, into the pine woods towards Maybury. Under cover of this, I pushed on, wet and shivering now, towards my own house. I walked among the trees, trying to find the footpath. It was very dark indeed in the wood, for the lightning was now becoming infrequent, and the hail, which was pouring down in a torrent, fell in columns through the gaps in the heavy foliage. If I had fully realized the meaning of all the things I had seen, I should have immediately worked my way around through Byfleet to Street Coben, and so gone back to rejoin my wife at the Leatherhead. But that night the strangeness of things about me and my physical wretchedness prevented me, for I was bruised, weary, wet to the skin, deafened and blinded by the storm. I had a vague idea of going on to my own house, and that was as much as motive as I had. I staggered through the trees, fell into a ditch, and bruised my knees against a plank, and finally splashed out into the lane that ran down from the College Arms. I say splashed, for the storm water was sweeping sand down the hill in a muddy torrent. There, in the darkness, a man blundered into me, and sent me reeling back. Gave a cry of terror, sprang sideways, and rushed on before I could gather my wits sufficiently to speak with him. So heavy was the stress of the storm, just at this place, that I had the hardest task to win my way up the hill. I went up close to the fence on the left, and worked my way along its palings. Near the top I stumbled upon something soft, and by a flash of lightning saw between my feet a heap of black broadcloth and a pair of boots. Before I could distinguish clearly how the man lay, the flicker of light had passed. I stood over him, waiting for the next flash. When it came, I saw that he was a sturdy man, cheaply but not shabbily dressed. His head was bent under his body, and he lay crumpled up close to the fence, though he had been flung violently against it. Overcoming the repugnance natural to one who had never before touched a dead body, I stooped and turned to him to feel for his heart. It's quite dead. Apparently his neck had been broken. The lightning flashed for a third time, and his face leapt upon me. I sprang to my feet. The landlord of the Spotted Dog, whose conveyance I had taken. I stepped over him gingerly and pushed on up the hill, and made my way to the police station and the College Arms towards my own house. Nothing was burning on the hillside, though from the common there still came a red glare and a rolling tumult of ruddy smoke, beating up against the drenching hail. So far, I could see by the flashes of the houses about me were mostly uninjured, but the College Arms had a dark heap lay in the road. Down the road towards Maybury Bridge there were voices and the sound of feet, but I had not the courage to shout or to go to them. I let myself in with a latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door. Staggered to the foot of the staircase and sat down. My imagination was full of those striding metallic monsters, of the dead body smashed against the fence. I crouched at the foot of the staircase with my back to the wall, shivering violently. Alright, that was the end of chapter 10. Excuse me again while I take a good quick drink. Reading really is thirsty work. Chapter 11. At the Window. I've already said that my storms of emotion have a trick of exhausting themselves. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet, got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room and drank some whiskey. Then I was moved to change my clothes. After I had done that, I went upstairs to my study. But why I did so, I do not know. The window of my study looks over the trees in the railway towards Horsell Common. In the hurry of our departure, this window had been left open. The passage was dark, and by contrast with the picture of the window frame enclosed, the side of the room seemed impenetrably dark. I stopped short of the doorway. The thunderstorm had passed, the towers of the Oriental College and the pine trees about it had gone, and very far away, lit by a vivid red glare, the common, about the sandpits, was visible. Across the light, huge black shapes, grotesque and strange, moved busily to and fro. It seemed indeed as if the whole country, in that direction, was on fire, a broad hillside set with minute tongues of flame, swaying and writhing with the gusts of the dying storm, and throwing a red reflection upon the cloud scud above. Every now and then, a haze of smoke from some nearer conflagration drove across the window and hid the Martian shapes. I could not see what they were doing, nor the clear form of them, nor recognize the black objects they were busied upon. Neither could I see the nearer fire, though the reflections of it danced on the wall and ceiling of the study. A sharp, resinous tang of burning was in the air. I closed the door noiselessly and crept towards the window. As I did so, the view opened out until, on the one hand, it reached to the houses about Woking Station, and on the other, to the charred blackened pine woods of the Byfleet. There was a light down below the hill, on a railway near the arch. Several of the houses along the Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me first. There were a black heap and a vivid glare, and to the right of that row of yellow oblongs. Then I perceived this was a wrecked train, or part of it smashed and on fire, the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these three main centers of light, the houses, the train, the burning country towards Jobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. It was the strangest spectacle that black expanse set with fire. It reminded me more than anything else of the potteries at night. At first I could distinguish not people at all, though I peered intently for them. Later I saw the light of Woking Station on a number of black figures hurrying one after the other across the line. And this was the little world in which I had been living securely for years, this fiery chaos. What had happened the last 7 hours I still did not know. Nor did I know, though I was beginning to guess, the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I had seen disgorged from the cylinder. With a queer feeling of impersonal interest, I turned my desk chair to the window, sat down, stared at the blackened country, and particularly at the three gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sandpits. Seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms? If such a thing I felt was impossible. Or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, using as much a man's brain that sits and rules his body? I began to compare the things to human machines, to ask myself for the first time in my life how an ironclad or a steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. The storm had left the sky clear. Over the smoke of the burning land, the little fading pinpoint of Mars was dropping to the west. When a soldier came into my garden, I heard a slight scraping of the fence, and roused myself from the lethargy that had fallen upon me. I looked down and saw him dimly clambering over the palings. At the sight of another human being, my torpor passed, and I leaned out of the window eagerly. "Hist!" I said in a whisper. Stopped astride of the fence, in doubt. Then he came over and crossed the lawn to the corner of the house, bent down and stepped softly. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering, standing under the window and peering up. "Where are you going?" I asked. "God knows." "Trying to hide?" "That's it." "Come into the house," I said. I went down, unfastened the door, and let him in. Locked the door again. I could not see his face. He was hatless, and his coat was unbuttoned. "God," he said, as I drew him in. "What has happened?" I asked. "What hasn't?" In the obscurity I could see he made a gesture of despair. "They wiped us out, simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. He followed me, almost mechanically, into the dining room. "Take some whiskey," I said, pouring out a stiff dose. He drank it. Then abruptly he sat down before the table and put his head on his arms and began to sob and weep like a little boy, in a perfect passion of emotion, while I, with a curious forgetfulness of my own recent despair, stood beside him, wondering. It was a long time before he could steady his nerves to answer my questions. Then he answered perplexedly and brokenly. He was a driver in the artillery, and had only come into the action at about 7. After that, the firing was going on across the common, and he said it was said the first party of Martians were crawling slowly towards their second cylinder under cover of a metal shield. Later, this shield, staggered upon a tripod legs, became the first of the fighting machines I had seen. The gun he drove had been unlimbered near Horsell. In order to command the sandpits and its arrival, it was that had precipitated the action. As the limber gunners went to the rear, his horse trod in a rabbit hole and came down, throwing him into the depression on the ground. At the same moment, the gun exploded behind him. Ammunition blew up. There was fire all about him, and he found himself laying under a heap of charred dead men and dead horses. I lay still, he said, scared out of my wits, with the forequarter of a horse on top of me. We'd been hit, wiped out, and the smell. Good God, like burnt meat. I was hurt across the back by the fall of the horse. There I had to lie until I felt better. Just like parade it had been a minute before, then stumble, bang, swish. Wiped out, he said. It hid under the dead horse for a long time, peeping out furtively across the common. The Cardigan men had tried to rush in a skirmishing order at the pit, simply to be swept out of the existence. Then the monster had risen to its feet and begun to walk leisurely to and fro across the common, among the few fugitives, with its head-like hood turning about exactly like the head of a cowled human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case, about which green flashes scintillated, and out of the funnel of there smoked the heat ray. In a few minutes there was, so far the soldier could see, not a living thing left upon the common, and every bush and tree upon it was not already a blackened skeleton. Was burning. The hussars had been on the road beyond the curvature of the ground, and he saw nothing of them. He heard the Martians rattle for a time, then become still. The giant saved Woking Station and its cluster of houses until the last. Then, in a moment, the heat ray was brought to bear, and the town became a heap of fiery ruins. Then the thing shut off the heat ray, and turning its back upon the artillerymen, began to waddle away towards the smoldering pine woods that sheltered the second cylinder. As it did so, a second glittering titan built itself up out of the pit. The second monster followed the first. At that, the artillerymen began to crawl very cautiously across the hot heather ash towards Horsell. He managed to get alive into the ditch by the side of the road, and so escaped to Woking. There his story became ejaculatory. The place was impassable. It seemed that there were few people alive there, frantic for the most part, and many burned and scalded. He was turned aside by the fire and hid among some almost scorching heaps of broken wall. As one of the Martian giants returned, he saw this one pursue a man, catch him up in one of its steely tentacles, and knock his head against the trunk of a pine tree. At last, after nightfall, the artillerymen made a rush for it, and got over the railway embankment. Since then, he had been skulking along towards Maybury, in the hope of getting out of danger. Londonward, people were hiding in the trenches and cellars, and many of the survivors had made off towards the Woking village and Sen. He had been consumed with thirst until he found one of the water mains near the railway arch smashed, and the water bubbling out like a spring upon the road. That was the story I got for him. Bit by bit, he grew calmer, telling me and trying to make me see the things he had seen. He had eaten no food since midday, he told me early in his narrative, and I found some mutton and bread in the pantry and brought it into the room. We lit no lamp for fear of attracting the Martians, and ever again our hands would touch upon the red meat as he talked. Things about us came darkly out of the darkness, and the trampled bushes and broken rose trees outside of the window grew distinct. It would seem that a number of men and animals had rushed across the lawn. I began to see his face, blackened and haggard, as no doubt mine was also. When he had finished eating, we went softly upstairs to my study, and I looked out again of the open window. In one night the valley had become a valley of ashes. Fire had dwindled now. Where flames had been, there were now streamers of smoke, but the countless ruins of shattered and gutted houses and blasted and blackened trees that the night had hidden stood out now, gaunt and terrible in the pitiless light of dawn. Yet here and there some object had the luck to escape. A white railway signal here, the end of a greenhouse there. White and fresh amid the wreckage, never before in history of warfare had destruction been so indiscriminate and so universal. And shining with the growing light of the east, 3 of the metallic giants stood about the pit, their cowls rotating as though they were surveying the desolation they had made. It seemed to me that the pit had been enlarged, and ever and again puffs of vivid green vapor streamed up out of it towards the brightening dawn. Streamed up, whirled smoke, and vanished. Beyond were pillars of fire about Jobham. They became pillars of bloodshot smoke, the first touch of day. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. What I saw of the destruction of Weybridge and Shepperton. As the dawn grew brighter, we withdrew from the window from which we had watched the Martians, and went very quietly downstairs. The artilleryman agreed with me that the house was no place to stay in. He proposed, he said, to make his way Londonward, and thence rejoin his battery, number 12 of the Horse Artillery. My plan was to return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I had determined to take my wife to New Haven, and to go with her out of the country forthwith, for I had already perceived clearly that the country about London must be inevitably the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between us and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder, with its guarding giants. Had I been alone, I think I should have taken my chance and struck across the country, but the artilleryman dissuaded me. It's no kindness to the right sort of wife, he said, to make her a widow, and in the end I agreed to go with him, under cover of the woods, northward as far as Street Jobham before I parted with him. Thence I would make a big detour by the Epsom to reach the Leatherhead. I should have started at once, but my companion had been in active service, and he knew better than that. He made me ransack the house for a flask which he filled with whiskey, and we lined every available pocket with packets of biscuits and slices of meat. Then we crept out of the house and ran quickly as we could down the ill-made road by which I had come overnight. The house seemed deserted. In the road lay a group of 3 charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray. And here and there were things that people had dropped: a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon, and the like poor valuables. At the corner, turning up towards the post office, a little cart filled with boxes and furniture and horseless heeled over a broken wheel. The cash box had been hastily smashed open and thrown under the debris. except the lodge of the orphanage, which was still on fire. None of the houses had suffered very greatly here. The heat ray had shaved the chimney tops and passed, yet, save ourselves, there did not seem to be a living soul on Maybury Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, supposed, by way of the old Woking Road, the road that I had taken when I drove to Leatherhead, or they had hidden. We went down the lane, by the body of the man in black, sodden now from the overnight hail, and broke into the woods at the foot of the hill. We pushed through these towards the railway, without meeting a soul. The woods across the line were but the scarred and blackened ruins of woods. For the most part, the trees had fallen, but a certain proportion still stood, dismal gray stems with dark brown foliage instead of green. On our side, the fire had done no more than scorch nearer trees. It had failed to secure its footing. In one place, the woodmen had been at work on Saturday. Trees, felled and freshly trimmed, lay in a clearing, with heaps of sawdust by the sawing machine and its engine. Hard by was a temporary hut. Deserted, there was not a breath of wind this morning. Everything was strangely still. Even the birds were hushed. And as we hurried along, I and the artillerymen talked in whispers, and looked now and again over our shoulders. Once or twice we stopped to listen. After a time we drew near the road, and as we did so we heard the clatter of hoofs, saw through the tree stems 3 cavalry soldiers. Riding slowly towards Woking, we hailed them, and they halted while we hurried towards them. It was Lieutenant and a couple of privates of the 8th Hussars, with a stand like theodolite, which the artillerymen told me was a heliograph. "You are the first men I've seen coming this way this morning," said the lieutenant. "What's brewing?" His voice and face were eager. The men behind him stared curiously. The artillerymen jumped down the bank into the road and saluted. "Gun destroyed last night, sir. I've been hiding, trying to rejoin my battery, sir." "You'll come in sight of the Martians, I expect, in about half a mile along this road." "What the dickens are they like?" asked the lieutenant. "Giants in armor, sir. 100 feet high, 3 legs and a body like aluminum. Mighty great head in the hood, sir." "Get out," said the lieutenant. "What confounded nonsense." "You'll see, sir. They carry a kind of box, sir, that shoots fire and strikes you dead." "What do you mean, a gun?" "No, sir." And the artilleryman began a vivid account of the heat ray. Halfway through, the lieutenant interrupted and looked up at me. I was still standing on the bank by the side of the road. "It's perfectly true," I said. "Well," said the lieutenant, "I suppose it's my business to see to it. Look here," to the artillerymen. "We're detailed here clearing people out of their houses. You'd better go along and report yourself to Brigadier General Marvin, and tell him all you know. He's at Weybridge. Know the way?" "I do," I said, and he turned his horse southward again. "Half a mile, you say?" said he. "At most," I answered, and pointed out over the treetops southward. He thanked me and rode on. We saw them no more. Further along we came upon a group of 3 women, 2 children in the road, busy clearing out a laborer's cottage. They had got a hold of a little hand truck and were piling it up with unclean-looking bundles, shabby furniture. There were also 2 assiduously engaged to talk to us as we passed. By Fleet Station, we emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. We were far beyond the range of the heat ray there, and it had not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the lines towards Woking. The day would have seemed like any other Sunday. Several farm wagons and carts were moving creakily along the road to Addlestone. Suddenly, through the gate of a field we saw across a stretch of flat meadow 6 12-pounders standing neatly at equal distance, pointing towards Woking. The gunners stood by the guns waiting, and the ammunition wagons were a business-like distance. The men stood almost as if under inspection. "That's good," I said. "I will get in one fair shot at any rate." The artillerymen hesitated at the gate. I shall go on, he said. Farther on towards Weybridge, just over the bridge, there were a number of men in white fatigue jackets throwing up a large rampart and more guns behind. It's bows and arrows against the lightning, anyhow, said the artillerymen. They haven't seen that fire beam yet, sorry. The officers who were not actively engaged stood and stared over the treetops southwestward, and the men digging would stop every now and then to stare in the same direction. Byfleet was in tumult. People packing, and a score of hussars, some of them dismounted, some on horseback, were hunting them about. 3 or 4 black government wagons with crosses in their white circles had an old omnibus, among other vehicles, were being loaded in the village street. There were scores of people, most of them sufficiently sabbatical to have assumed their best clothes. The soldiers were having the greatest difficulty in making them realize the gravity of their position. We saw one shriveled old fellow with a huge box and a score or more of flower pots containing orchids, angrily expostulating with the corporal, who would leave them behind. I stopped and gripped his arm. "Do you know what's over there?" I said, pointing at the pine tops that hid the Martians. "Eh?" he said, turning. "I was explaining this is valuable." "Death!" I shouted. "Death is coming! Death!" And leaving him to digest that if he could, I hurried on after the artillerymen. At the corner, I looked back. The soldier had left him, and he was still standing by his box with the pots of orchids on the lid of it, and staring vaguely over the trees. No one in Weybridge could tell us where the headquarters were established. The whole place was in such confusion as I had ever seen in a town before. Carts, carriages everywhere, a most astonishing miscellany of conveyances, and horseflesh. The respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costumes, wives prettily dressed, were packing riverside loafers, energetically helping children excited, and for the most part, highly delighted at this astonishing variation of their Sunday experiences. In the midst of it all, the worthy vicar was very pluckily holding an early celebration, and his bell was jangling above the excitement. I and the artillerymen, seated on the step of the drinking fountain, made a very passable meal upon what we had brought with us. Patrols of soldiers were no longer hussars, but grenadiers in white, were warning people to move now or take refuge in their cellars as soon as the firing began. We saw as we crossed the railway bridge that a growing crowd of people had assembled in and about the railway station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow the passage of troops and guns to Chertsey. And I have heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in the special trains that were put on at an hour later. We maintained at Weybridge until midday. At that hour we found ourselves at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and the Thames joined. Part of the time we spent helping 2 old women to pack a little cart. The Wey was a treble mouth, and at this point the boats were to be hired. There was a ferry across the river. On the Shepperton side was an inn with a lawn, and beyond that the tower of Shepperton Church. It has been replaced by spire, rose above the trees. Okay, this is a particularly long chapter. I think I'm going to call it after this one. There's still about 12-ish minutes left. Here we found an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives. As yet the flight had not grown to a panic, but there were already far more people than all the boats going to and fro can enable to cross. People came panting along under heavy burdens. One husband and wife were even carrying a small outhouse door between them, with some of their household goods piled thereon. One man told us he meant to try to get away from Shepperton Station. There was a lot of shouting, and one man was even jesting. The idea people seemed to have here was that the Martians were simply formidable human beings who might attack and sack the town, to be certainly destroyed in the end, Every now and then people would glance nervously across the way at the meadows toward Chertsey, but everything over there was still. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet, in vivid contrast to which the Surrey's side. The people who landed there from the boats were tramping off down the lane. A big ferry boat had just made a journey. 3 or 4 soldiers stood on the side of the stood on the lawn of the inn, staring and jesting at the fugitives without offering to help. The inn was closed, as it was now within prohibited hours. Just a second, I know it's mid-chapter, but my mouth is drying out again. Bear with me if you don't mind. "What's that?" cried a boatsman. And "Shut up, you fool," said a man near to me helping a dog. I'm sorry. "Shut up, you fool," said a man near me to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey, a muffled thud, the sound of a gun. The fighting was beginning. Almost immediately, the unseen batteries across the river to our right, the unseen because of the trees, took up the chorus, firing heavily, one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood, arrested by the sudden stir of battle. Near us, and yet invisible to us, nothing was to be seen, save flat meadows, cows feeding unconcernedly for the most part, silver-pollard windows motionless in the warm sunlight. "The soldiers'll stop them," said a woman beside me, doubtfully. A haziness rose over the treetops, and suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung, and forthwith the ground heaved underfoot, and heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in the houses near, leaving us astonished. "Here they are," shouted a man in a blue jersey. "Yonder, do you see them? Yonder!" Quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the armored Martians appeared, far away over the little trees, across the flat meadows that stretched towards Chertsey, striding hurriedly towards the river. Little cowled figures, they seemed at first, going with a rolling motion as fast as flying birds. Then, advancing obliquely towards us, came a 5th. Their armored bodies glittered in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew nearer. One of the extreme left, the remotest, that is, flourished a huge case high in the air, and the ghostly, terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night smote towards the Chertsey and struck the town. At sight of these strange, swift, and terrible creatures, the crowd near the water's edge seemed to me, but for a moment, horror-struck. There was no screaming or shouting, but silence. Then a hoarse murmur, and a movement of feet, and a splashing from the water. A man, too frightened to drop the portmanteau he carried on his shoulder, swung around and sent me staggering with a blow from the corner of his burden. A woman thrust at me with her hand and rushed past me. I turned with a rush of people, but I was not too terrified for the thought. Terrible heat ray was in my mind. To get under water, that was it. "Get under water," I shouted, unheeded. I faced about again, and rushed towards the approaching Martian, rushed right down to the gravelly beach, headlong into the water. Others did the same. Boatload of people putting back came, leaping out at us as I rushed past. The stones under my feet were muddy and slippery. The river was so low that I ran perhaps 20 feet, scarcely waist deep. Then, as the Martian towered overhead, scarcely a couple 100 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. Splashes of the people in the boats leaping into the river sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. People were landing hastily on both sides of the river, but the Martian machine took no more notice. moment of the people rushing this way and that, then a man would of confusion of ants in a nest, which was his foot kicked. When half suffocated, I raised my head above the water. Martian's hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river, and as it advanced, it swung loose what must have been the generator, the heat ray. In a moment, it was on the bank, and in a stride, wading halfway across, the knees of its foremost legs bent at the farther bank, and in another moment it had raised itself to its full height again, close to this village of Shepperton, forthwith 6 guns, which, unknown to anyone on the right bank, had been hidden behind the outskirts of that village, fired simultaneously. Sudden, near concussion, last close upon the first, made my heart jump. The monster was already racing the case generated in the heat ray. The first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. I gave a cry of astonishment. I saw and thought nothing the other 4 Martians saw. My intent was riveted upon the near incident. Simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air, near the body as the hood twisted around in time to receive, but not in time to dodge the 4th shell. The shell burst clean in the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, was whirled off in a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. "Hit!" I shouted, with something between a scream and a cheer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water about me. I could have leapt out of the water in that moment of exultation. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but it did not fall over. It recovered its balance by a miracle, and no longer heeding its steps, with the camera that fired the heat ray now rigidly upheld, it reeled swiftly upon Shepperton. The living intelligence, the Martian with the hood, was slain and splashed into the 4 winds of heaven. The thing that was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction, drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of the Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done, swerved aside, and blundered on, and collapsed with tremendous force into the river and out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a sprout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter had immediately flashed into steam. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore, almost but scaldingly hot, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards, and I heard their screaming and shouting faintly above, seething and roar of the Martian collapse. For a moment, I heeded nothing. The heat brought the patent need for self-preservation. I splashed through the tumultuous water, pushing aside a man in black to do so, till I could see round the bend. 6 deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian came into sight downstream, lying across the river and for the most part submerged. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and through tumultuously whirling wisps I could see, intermittently and vaguely, gigantic limbs churning the water and flinging splash and spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing were struggling for its life amid the waves. Enormous quantities of a ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted from this death by a furious yelling, like that of the thing called a siren in our manufacturing towns. A man knee-deep in the towing path, shouted inaudibly to me and pointed. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the riverbank from the direction of the Chertsey. The Shepperton guns spoke this time unavailingly. At that I ducked at once underwater, and holding my breath till movement was in agony, blundered painfully ahead under the surface as long as I could. The water was in tumult about me, rapidly growing hotter. When for a moment I raised my head to take a breath and throw the hair and water from my eyes, the steam was rising and whirling white fog first hid the Martians altogether. The noise was deafening. Then I saw them dimly. Colossal figures of gray, magnified by the mist. They had passed by me, and two were stepping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The third and fourth stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, and the other towards Laleham. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound, deafening and confusing conflict of noise. The clangorous din of the Martians, the crack of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds, flashing into flame, and the crackling of roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river, and the heat ray went to and fro over Weybridge, its impact marked by flashes of incandescent white that gave the place at once to a smoky dance of lurid flames. The nearer houses still stood intact, awaiting their fate, shadowy, faint, and pallid in the stream. The fire behind them, going to and fro. For a moment, perhaps I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Through the reek I could see the people who had been with me in the river scrambling out of the water, through the reeds, like little frogs hurrying through glass from the advance of man, or running to and fro in utterly dismay on the towing path. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping towards me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch, and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. The ray flickered up and down the towing path, licking off the people who ran this way and that, and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose in a boiling wheel crested with stream. I turned shoreward. In another moment, the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud, and scalded, half-blinded, agonized. I staggered through the leaping, hissing water towards the shore. Had my foot stumbled, it would have been the end. I fell helplessly, in full sight of the Martians upon the board, barely gravely spit that run down. I fell helplessly in full sight of the Martians upon the board, bare gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and Thames. I expected nothing but death. I have a dim memory of the foot of a Martian coming down within a score yards of my head, driving straight into the loose gravel, whirling it this way and that, lifting again, a long suspense, and then of the four carrying the debris of their comrade between them, now clear and presently faint through the veil of smoke, receding interminably, as it seemed to me, across a vast space of river and meadow. And then, very slowly, I realized by a miracle I had escaped. That was chapter 12, and that is also where I'll be calling this streaming session. As you could probably tell, I'm stumbling over a couple words. Just, I'll need to build up my endurance, and I'll get there eventually, but for now, that's where we're going to leave it. We're about 35% of the way through the book. So until next time,